The house was dark and still, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind restless. It had been one of those nights, one where sleep seemed just out of reach. I wasn't sure if it was the heat of the summer night or the thoughts swirling in my head, but I couldn't settle. The house felt different with her in it. It had been a year since my dad remarried, and I had never expected to feel so unsettled by it. My stepmom, Laura, had always been kind, always made an effort to bridge the gap between us. She was younger than my dad by a good 15 years, but they seemed happy, and for the most part, I'd accepted her as part of our lives. But lately, things had been different. There was a tension that I couldn't quite place, moments when our eyes met and lingered a little too long, conversations that felt charged with something neither of us could name. I knew I shouldn't be feeling this way about her, about my stepmom, of all people, but the connection was there, subtle and undeniable. I turned over in bed, trying to push the thoughts away, when I heard the soft creak of a door opening. My heart jumped in my chest, and I held my breath, listening. Footsteps, quiet and deliberate, made their way down the hall. A moment later, there was a gentle knock on my door. "Tom." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Are you awake?" I sat up, my heart racing for reasons I didn't want to admit. "Yeah, I'm awake. Is everything okay?" The door opened a fraction, and she slipped inside, closing it behind her with a quiet click. Laura stood there in the dim light, her hair loose around her shoulders, the oversized t-shirt she wore falling just below her thighs. There was something about seeing her like this, in the stillness of the night, that made the air between us feel heavier. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't sleep." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Me neither." She hesitated for a moment, then moved closer to the bed. "Mind if I sit?" Sure," I replied, scooting over to make room for her. My heart was pounding in my chest, the tension between us palpable. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on the comforter. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the unspoken words between us filling the room. I could feel the heat of her body next to mine, the way her presence seemed to shift the air in the room. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "About everything. About your dad, about us." There was a heaviness to her words, a vulnerability that caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "It's just things haven't been the same," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "With your dad, I mean. We're not connected anymore. Not the way we used to be." I glanced at her, my heart aching at the sadness in her voice. "I'm sorry, Laura. I didn't know." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not your fault. It's hard, you know? Feeling like you're drifting away from someone you thought you'd be with forever." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, until she finally looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "Tom," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you ever felt confused? About someone?" I didn't know how to answer that. My throat felt tight, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of the direction this conversation was heading. The tension in the room was thick, and I could feel my pulse quickening as I realized where this might be going. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice low and strained. "I think we've all felt that way at some point." Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer before she looked away, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But there's this connection between us. I know you feel it too." The words hung in the air between us, charged with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I knew I should say something, should push back against whatever this was, but I couldn't. Because she was right, I did feel it. I had been feeling it for weeks, maybe longer, and now that it was out in the open, there was no denying it. "Laura," I began, my voice shaky. "I don't know what to say. You're my stepmom, and this isn't right." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else, something darker, something I wasn't sure I could face. "I know," she whispered. But that doesn't change how I feel. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as I wrestled with the conflict inside me. I knew this was wrong, knew that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But the pull between us was too strong, too real to ignore. I felt the weight of her words settle over me, thick and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away from the edge of something dangerous and forbidden. But my body wouldn't listen. The tension between us had been building for weeks. Lingering glances, the way our conversations had taken on a different tone, the unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger every day. Laura's hand, which had been resting lightly on the bed, shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against mine. It was the softest of touches, but it sent a jolt through me, igniting something I hadn't been able to admit to myself. I should have moved away, should have told her this was a mistake, but instead, I stayed still, letting her fingers curl around mine. The silence between us was unbearable, filled with everything we weren't saying. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. Laura's breathing was shallow, her eyes fixed on where our hands met, her lips parted slightly as if she was about to speak, but no words came. I turned toward her, my hand still in hers, and our eyes met. The vulnerability in her gaze, the way she was searching for something, anything, made it impossible for me to look away. There was no going back from this moment, I knew that. And yet, the pull was undeniable. "Laura," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "We can't." "I know," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I know this is wrong, but I don't know how to stop feeling this way." Her confession hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The reality of what we were doing, the line we were about to cross, was too much. But as I looked into her eyes, saw the raw emotion there, I realized I felt the same. I had been denying it for too long, trying to push it down, but now that it was out in the open, there was no ignoring it. Without thinking, I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was intimate, soft, and I saw the way her breath caught in her throat. My hand lingered on her cheek for a moment longer than it should have, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "We shouldn't," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew I didn't mean it. She leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment before she looked up at me again. "I know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I don't care anymore." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. Our lips met in a soft, hesitant kiss, the kind that was filled with all the uncertainty and fear of what we were doing. It was tentative at first, a test to see if this was real, but when she didn't pull away, something inside me shifted. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as if we were both trying to savor every moment, every touch. My hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, and I could feel the way her body trembled against mine. Her fingers tightened around mine, and I knew that this was it. There was no going back. Laura's lips were soft and warm, and the way she kissed me back, with so much emotion, so much need, made my head spin. I had never expected this, had never imagined that we would end up here, but now that we were, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. Her eyes were dark, filled with the same mix of desire and guilt that I was feeling, but she didn't pull away. Neither of us did. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop. I don't want to stop." Her words mirrored my own thoughts, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. The weight of what we had just done, what we were about to do, hung heavy in the air between us. But as I looked at her, saw the way she was struggling with the same feelings, the same conflict, I realized that we were in this together. I cupped her face in my hands, my thumbs brushing lightly over her cheeks as I whispered, "We don't have to figure it all out right now. Let's just be here." In this moment, she nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she leaned into me again, pressing her lips to mine in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent than before. There was a desperation in the way we kissed, as if we both knew that this moment couldn't last, but neither of us was ready to let it go. Her hands slid up my chest, fingers trembling as they explored the contours of my body, and I could feel the heat between us building. Every touch, every kiss sent shivers through me, igniting a fire that I knew couldn't be extinguished. As we kissed, as our bodies pressed closer together, the room seemed to shrink around us, the world outside fading away until there was nothing left but the two of us. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear, so impenetrable, were gone, and all that remained was the connection we had been trying to deny for so long. Laura's hands moved to my shoulders, her fingers digging into my skin as she pulled me down onto the bed beside her. The feel of her body beneath mine, the way her breath hitched as our lips met again, sent a wave of heat through me that I couldn't control. I knew we were crossing a line, knew that this was something we could never take back, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was her touch, her kiss, the way she made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. "Tom," she whispered, her voice breathless as she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and fear. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my hand gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I've never been more sure of anything." With that, the last of our restraint crumbled, and we gave in to the emotions that had been simmering between us for so long. Our kisses grew more intense, more urgent, and soon, the world outside disappeared completely. We lost ourselves in each other, the world outside ceasing to exist as the heat between us grew with every passing moment. The soft hum of the house faded into the background as our breaths became the only sounds in the room, mingling together in a rhythm that felt both foreign and inevitable. Laura's hands traced the contours of my body with a gentleness that sent shivers down my spine, her touch igniting every nerve. I knew this was a moment we couldn't walk away from unchanged. I kissed her deeply, feeling the weight of the forbidden in every touch, every movement. The air between us was thick with tension, with everything that had gone unspoken for too long. Her fingers dug into my shoulders, pulling me closer as if she needed to feel every part of me, to erase the distance that had existed between us. There was no more hesitation, no more second-guessing. We had crossed the line, and neither of us wanted to stop. Our lips met again and again, the kisses growing more urgent, more desperate as the intensity between us built. Her breath hitched as my hands explored her, my fingers tracing the curve of her waist, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath the thin fabric of her shirt. She was trembling, her body responding to every touch, and I could feel the same tension coursing through me, the same desire pulling me closer to her. I pulled her to me, our bodies pressed together, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against my chest. My hands slid beneath her shirt, feeling the softness of her skin as I lifted it over her head. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and vulnerable, and for a moment, the reality of what we were doing hit me like a tidal wave. But the look in her eyes, the way she was watching me, made it impossible to stop. "Are you sure?" I whispered again, my voice thick with emotion. Laura nodded, her hands reaching for me, pulling me down into another kiss. "I don't want to stop," she murmured against my lips, her voice trembling with the same intensity one felt. "I need this." The words sent a shiver through me, and any remaining doubts I had vanished. This wasn't just about the physical connection between us, though that was undeniable. This was about something deeper, something we had both been searching for, something that made us feel alive, even if it was dangerous. We moved together, slowly at first, savoring every moment, every touch. Her hands slid up my back, her fingers tracing the lines of my shoulders as I kissed her neck, her collarbone, my lips finding every inch of her that I could. She arched beneath me, a soft gasp escaping her lips, and the sound of it sent a wave of desire crashing over me. Her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, and I could feel the way her body responded to mine, the way every touch seemed to draw us deeper into each other. It was as if the tension that had been building between us for so long had finally reached its breaking point, and now there was no holding back. We gave in completely, the last remnants of restraint crumbling as we moved together in perfect sync. Every touch, every kiss was filled with an intensity that left me breathless, and I could feel the same urgency in her, the same need to forget everything else and lose ourselves in this moment. As our movements grew more urgent, more frantic, the world outside disappeared completely. There was no more guilt, no more second-guessing, just the connection between us, the way our bodies fit together as if they had always been meant to. The heat between us was overwhelming, consuming, and I knew that there was no turning back. When it was over, we lay there together in the quiet, our breathing still heavy, our bodies tangled together in the aftermath of everything that had just happened. The weight of what we had done began to settle over me, slowly at first, like a distant whisper that grew louder with each passing second. I looked over at Laura, her hair fanned out across the pillow, her chest still rising and falling as she caught her breath. Her eyes were closed, but I could see the same conflict in her expression, the same mixture of desire and guilt that I felt. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and her eyes fluttered open, meeting mine. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was thick with everything we weren't saying, everything we didn't know how to say. I wanted to tell her that it was okay, that we'd figure this out, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. How could anything about this be okay? She began, her voice breaking the stillness, but she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the bed as if she couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. I know, I whispered, my hand still resting on her cheek. I know. She closed her eyes again, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "What have we done?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to answer. I didn't know what to say, because I was asking myself the same thing. What had we done? How had we let this happen? I pulled her closer, wrapping my arms around her as if that could somehow make everything better, as if holding her could erase the consequences of what we had just done. But the truth was, nothing could change the fact that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As we lay there in the quiet, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us, the reality of what we had done settling in. There was no going back, no pretending that this hadn't happened. We had given in to something that we both knew was wrong, and now we had to face the consequences. But even as the guilt and confusion swirled around us, there was a part of me that couldn't regret it. There was a part of me that still wanted her, still needed her in a way that I couldn't explain. And I knew that she felt the same. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Together. Laura looked up at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around mine. I don't know if I can live with this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can live with the guilt. Her words tore at my heart, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make this right, how to fix what we had done. All I knew was that I couldn't let her go. Not now. We'll find a way, I said softly, though the doubt in my own voice betrayed me. She didn't respond, just rested her head against my chest, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin as we lay there in the quiet. The weight of everything hung over us like a cloud, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the minutes ticked by, the reality of what we had done began to settle in. The guilt, the shame, the fear of what would happen next, it all weighed heavily on us, and I could feel the tension between us growing once more. I should go, Laura whispered finally, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, though the thought of her leaving filled me with a sense of dread. I understand. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around her as she gathered her clothes. The intimacy of the moment was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that neither of us knew how to break. When she was fully dressed, she turned to me, her eyes filled with sadness. I don't know what this means, she said softly. For us. For everything. Neither do I admitted, my heart aching at the uncertainty in her voice. But we'll figure it out. Somehow. Laura nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. I hope so. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the quiet, the weight of everything we had done pressing down on me like a heavy stone. As I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. There was no going back to the way things had been, no pretending that this hadn't happened. We had crossed a line, and now we were left to face the consequences. But even as the guilt and confusion swirled around me, there was a part of me that still longed for her, still wanted her in a way that I couldn't deny. And I knew that, no matter what happened next, we would both have to live with the choices we had made.